Welcome back. Senegal President Macky Sall has announced intentions to step down from office once his term ends on the 2nd of April. However, opposition parties and residents are not buying this, saying he must do the right thing and step down immediately and also release their political leaders from prison. Parliament voted 2 weeks ago to postpone tomorrow's presidential election until the 15th of December, leading to violent protests into the capital of Dakar and other cities. Joining us now to unpack President Sall's statement is political analyst Musa Mdunge. Musa, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Now, Senegal is a secular republic, with some saying that perhaps it has a strong presidency and maybe a weak legislature and a weak judiciary and multiple political parties. Under the 2001 Constitution, presidents serve for 5 years and are limited to 2 terms. What do you think was Sall's initial game plan in postponing elections to 15 December?
Well, good evening, Katlego, and thank you so much for having me, and good evening to your viewers. Well, look, I think his game play had really more to do with his own political party's popularity, a doubt that, you know, those who would follow him would be able to maintain his legacy. He has, you know, somewhat garnered some support, somewhat of a reputation, even within the region. He's seen as a key player in ECOWAS, and currently, given the challenges that that region is facing, he would have been seen as a critical voice and to make a critical contribution into those affairs. And, you know, his exit leaves essentially a power vacuum in Senegal and in the role that Senegal would play. I would liken it, if I would, to what may happen, you know, later this year. Well, we now already know, you know, here in South Africa when the elections will be. You know, depending how those elections are expected to be, might leave a power vacuum within South Africa and within the role that South Africa plays. And so the same could be said for Senegal, given the strategic importance of that country in West Africa as a region.
Right. And of course, I mean, opposition parties as well as then the Concord ruled that the elections must be brought forward. And now Sall announces that he would not be standing for a third term, of which, of course, he wouldn't be able to. What do you think then were the factors that led to this decision, and what influenced him in making this particular announcement?
Well, look, I would like to assume that one, it wouldn't be for the legacy that he wants to leave behind. It wouldn't be good for the framing of that legacy for it to be framed under conditions of greater political uncertainty and protest in that country. We know that opposition leaders have been quite buoyant in their protest to the events and to his announcement of the extension of his term. And as well, you know, given the role that he plays and given the importance of Senegal, I would imagine that there was external pressure that came to bear in this particular decision. I would imagine countries like the United States, which have somewhat been vocal, far more vocal about what has happened in Senegal than they have been, you know, in countries, say, such as Niger or even in Gabon. You know, they would have been much more vocal when it comes to Senegal, given that historically it is the center, or it is the center of the West African region. And so a very key hub, if you think of Dakar and the importance of that particular regional hub and the role that that port plays in that particular region economically, but also for the United States, very critical when you think that, you know, it has always wanted to have a foothold in Africa. And Senegal presents as one of those countries that has been a critical partner for the United States. So I would imagine external factors have come to bear. On the internal front, certainly, given the Constitutional Court's decision, given that decision, you know, to nullify that decision by the president, it is, you know, again, speaking to that legacy that he wants to conserve. It just doesn't look good for the president to keep pushing on a matter where clearly the bulk of his people would like to see fresh elections, would like to see new leadership taking over, you know, for the sake of the Senegalese economy, but more so for the role that that country plays in the region. So many questions are being asked about that region, and Senegal is key in finding those answers.
I mean, with this decision, Musa, to move the election date closer, what impact then do you think this might have on the political landscape in Senegal?
Well, the hope, is that it would bring to bear, a more peaceful resolution to the state of internal conflict, as we have witnessed over the past few weeks. That is the hope, I would assume, from the president, from the government. But as we clearly see with many opposition leaders who have already spoken of boycotting, this so-called dialogue that the president is setting up to try and find a political resolution to the challenges of the country, that already doesn't bode well for the president's goal here. But, given that he has taken this decision, what remains is for him to then proclaim on a date for the election. And that is still what we are waiting for. Only a date will really give the greatest signal towards peace and security in that country and a move towards a peaceful transition. Without that pronunciation by the president, then even these efforts, even these announcements may fall short. Given how opposition parties could react and will likely react without that date.
Speaking of those opposition parties, how might this change in date then affect their strategies and the coalition building amongst those coalition parties in the efforts of building Senegal?
Well, look, clearly by the president's actions here, it kind of paints a picture that is favorable for the opposition parties to say that they could frame the legacy of his government as one of chaos. The fact that the president could undermine the very constitution he is said to protect, to promote, is an argument that the opposition parties can rally behind. The impact of corruption, which has continued to undermine the efforts of this president, this incumbent president, in his efforts to build the Senegalese economy, is something that they could definitely speak towards. But thirdly, and most importantly, is they themselves have got to present to the Senegalese people a concrete plan and a vision for the country. What is it that they are going to do? How is it that they are going to go about it? What proof, what evidence can they bring to bear about their capacity to do these things? And what time frames are they giving themselves in order to achieve those set goals? It's not enough for the government to implode. It is important that the opposition coalition must stand strong behind set ideological and value propositions here. And this will be key. And if they can maintain a unified message going into whenever these elections are set to be, then that may well swing, power towards them. But of course, it's also going to be critical to see how do the institutions stand. And that's the important part. All the democratic institutions that are there to ensure that, government behaves in a manner that they respect, the mechanisms that have been presented to ensure that the legitimacy of the state is maintained. That is why these elections are going to be important, because it is about the legitimacy of the state, and not only that, the government that is going to come in, its legitimacy to roll out its agenda as it sees fit.
So, Musa, do you think there's a tone of dictatorship from this current government?
Well, certainly, such actions, may push such a perception that this may be framed somewhat as a dictatorship, but I see it more as not so much about a dictatorship, but certainly there is a belief in the framing of democracy, in the importance of democracy, but not so much the government and the governing party's ability, perhaps, to win the election. So not a confidence in how they have executed their agenda. And I think that is at the center of why they may have moved the way that they have moved. And this perhaps, Katlego, would be a seminal note for South Africa, for the African National Congress, which has had its manifesto that, according to the performance of the governing party, it may well see itself also out of time. And one of the kind of things that you and I, as people in the space of media, need to be looking out for to ensure that we keep the government, and the state institutions in check as we move towards the elections. So Senegal presents a seminal note for us as well.
I mean, also, by 2035, Senegal aims to achieve emerging market status. And of course, they're using the Emerging Senegal Plan as an economic and social development program for Senegal, which was launched by President Sall in 2014. Now, of course, this is a plan that has long-term projects that are aimed at transforming the country's economy and improving the living conditions of its population. In your opinion, has this program fared? How has it fared? And do you think there'll be like a continued growth of its implementation in his absence?
Well, look, I think he was on the right agenda here, and it is a good and a key ambition for Senegal. And I think a country of its weight, a country of its geopolitical significance, should be able to reach emerging economic status quite quickly, given the fact that if you think of Africa and how it has been positioned. One of the youngest continents, you have, of course, this continental free trade agreement within the continent, and Senegal is central towards ensuring that economic integration, not only in West Africa, but certainly the rest of the continent. It has a key role in that particular agenda. And somewhat, he's had some set of results here. If we think that in 2022, Senegal's economy grew at about 4.7% economic growth, it rebounded in 2023 to 5.3% economic growth, and that bodes well for Senegal, particularly when we think in the context of the region that it finds itself. When we think of how poor Nigeria is doing as the regional economic powerhouse, Senegal is punching above its weight, and so the president can take a bow in that sense. But that's largely been boiled down to also having factors like stable political economic climate, and that is key. And so the results of his actions in the past months, go counter to the progress he has tried to make in terms of economic development in that country. And one would then argue that the president is further ditching the chances of his party in the elections and in the date that he's about to set for those elections.
Now, as we continue with this discussion, Senegal has been seen as one of the region's most stable democracies. However, these disputes, like we mentioned earlier on, have plunged the country into a political crisis that have sparked these deadly protests. Can the region go back to its stable ways, given elections were meant to take place tomorrow?
Well, look, I think that the country can go back to its stable ways. It will require political will, primarily, and, from the government, from President Macky Sall, and already you see the fact that, former presidents, such as Abdou Diouf as well as Abdoulaye Wade have both, called on the president to call on this national dialogue without dialogue to call, and have also called for the immediate end to violence. And so they support, even from former leaders, for a political resolution to the challenges of the country. So as I said, the quicker the president, announces the date of the elections, the quicker Senegal puts the logistical weight behind that date, which will be very critical, and ensure that all the institutions of the state are geared towards those elections. That will be very important. And also the support of ECOWAS and the strength of ECOWAS needs to come to bear. And unfortunately, that particular regional organization is facing challenges, and its legitimacy as a viable vehicle in which, regional conflicts are resolved and in which greater political economic integration is greater festered, seems to be upended in that particular region. And so, you need a stronger ECOWAS and you need a stronger Senegal, and both need each other, I would argue. It is possible for the country to go back to that, but again, it will require political will on both sides. Mm-hmm. And even among opposition leaders, we require to see a response even from them. There needs to be, a response from them to go back, to go back into the barricades, and as well to support the political solution and go for these elections. And so, it will be key to see, how the likes, of Bassirou Diomaye will respond in terms of these particular elections. These are key people who will be very key in their response in rallying opposition party towards going for a more peaceful resolution rather than the one where we continue to see conflict and protests in that country.
You make mention of previous presidents that are now weighing in. You mentioned earlier on that the USA is also weighing in, and of course ECOWAS. Do you think there's enough of a role being played by regional and international actors in monitoring and providing assistance in this current situation?
Yes, certainly, or as we've already spoken, ECOWAS has a particular role that it should play. The AU, the African Union, has a particular role that it needs to play in terms of the conflict, in terms of the political crisis in Senegal and the other, regional issues that have impacted West Africa, particularly in the past 2 to 3 years. And as well, of course, the United Nations has its particular role. There are many players that can play a role, and I would imagine that even South Africa itself, as a continental power, would be looking with interest to see what is happening, in Abuja's backyard, with great concern. And if you think about this particular year, you think about what's happening in the Middle East, in Egypt's backyard. You think about what's happening in West Africa, in Nigeria's backyard. And you think to a lesser extent what's happening in South Africa's own backyard. A question can be posed about the role that these particular 3 countries need to play and how better they need to then come together in order to find better resolutions and, in terms of the challenges that the continent faces. And so country like Senegal falling into the political crisis it is falling into is certainly an indictment into the global political system as we have known it since 1945. And the rise of so many conflicts in a year such as the one we find ourselves in is an indictment on Washington, D.C., and how it has been a leader, in the world, and how it exercised its responsibility. And so, many external players have a particular role that they can play, but I would argue, Katlego, that the prime responsibility in dealing with this challenge is for the Senegalese people. They are at the center of the solutions that they need.
Most certainly. So, Musa, in your opinion, what are the main challenges that President Macky Sall's successor will potentially face?
Well, one is that whoever that successor may be will have the challenge of unifying the country. And to do that, it will take more than just, small talk, but it will require, an effort towards the rebuilding of institutions, ensuring that Parliament remains strong, Parliament is able to exercise accountability and a check and a balance towards the power of the executive. It will require strengthening the judiciary in its capacity to ensure that it is able to try cases, and it will ensure a going back to rule of law and as well as political, sustainability through ensuring a government that provides predictable working policies. That's what this president, whoever he or she may be, will need to do if they're going to win the confidence of the people. They're going to need to rebuild that confidence by building bridges towards the opposition parties. And what may in fact be required for this country to rebuild is perhaps a conversation about a government of national unity, one that will bring all the opposition parties, all the different power brokers in one space, in order to truly build, a Senegal that truly can take its place in the region, in the continent, and in the globe. If that particular leader can do that, then certainly they will win the day, and certainly we will see less crises in West Africa as one of the key players returns back into the place that it must play. Senegal has a key role to play, and a country like this cannot regress. We need to see it go forward.
Most certainly. Lastly, Musa, earlier on you mentioned that the exit of President Sall will tantamount to a power vacuum. And now he's going to be the first Senegalese president to plan an election that he's not a part of. Who do you think is most likely to win?
Well, it will likely turn towards his, the vice president, I would believe, is likely to be the one who will ascend. But that will depend on how badly the events of the past weeks have impacted the ruling party's ability to be able to shun off, a perception that it is tearing apart democracy and tearing apart the political system as it has been known. So it will be very important to see what will happen in terms of the vice president. But I would imagine that other candidates as well will also play a very, very key role in these particular elections. The likes of Bassirou Diomaye Faye, as I mentioned, is likely to play a key role in this election. It is not clear if they would likely win, yet in this particular election. Unfortunately, we've also seen other candidates decide to step down from running in these elections. Such a candidate as Rose Wardini, it would have seen a female candidate also make her stake in these particular elections. But unfortunately, following the controversy over her dual Franco-Senegalese nationality, she will no longer stand in those elections. So, it's still a give and take on who will likely rise in these particular elections. And already, when we see such controversies coming to the fore, one gets a sense that the ruling party is scared that, they may not likely, ascend as the victors in these elections. And this may be why the actions of the president as have happened.
Well, Musa, certainly great speaking to you. One certainly to look out for. I hope we will have this conversation in the near future to see who will be the ruling president of Senegal. Thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure. That was political analyst Musa Mdunge unpacking for us there the looming elections that are set to take place in Senegal.